Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Heritage Matters webinar featuring our very own Dr. Amareshwar Gala. My name is Sonya Bekkerman. I am here as a representative of Green Sakthi. For those of you unfamiliar with Green Sakthi is a nonprofit environmental program founded by Sri Shakti Amma in 1996 in Peetam, South India, that grows and plants trees, over 1.8 million to date, manages 2 tons of waste with its zero waste management program, educates local school kids about Mother Earth, and so much more. Most importantly, it is a collective committed to deepening the relationship between people and nature. Today is a very special day. Today is World Environment Day. And so it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Amareshwar Gala. Today of all days, as Amar is one of the leading advocates for tree planting, afforestation, and cultural rights of indigenous local peoples. Today is a day of awareness and action. To protect our environment, we can grow, plant, rewild, regenerate, and reimagine a greener world. So Amar's bio is extensive and fascinating, and I will only mention, for those unfamiliar, that Dr. Gala is currently Professor of Inclusive Cultural Leadership and holder of UNESCO Chair on Inclusive Museums and Sustainable Heritage Development, Anand National University, Ahmedabad, India. He's the founding executive director of the International Institute for the Inclusive Museum. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with Amar's bio, we will ensure that there is a link in the chat box so you can learn more. So on World Environment Day, we have an opportunity to act. And at the start of this webinar, we have received an extremely generous anonymous donation of approximately 1,000 Australian dollars to Green Sakthi. So that way we may continue our mission to green our planet. And we invite you to do the same to honor this day. So thank you to this incredibly generous donor. We will also place the link to donate in the chat box so that you can make a donation from your heart and also familiarize yourself with Green Sakthi. So in light of World Environment Day, Dr. Gala has chosen a fascinating and a holy topic, tree planting as a spiritual journey. Thank you, Amar. Take us all on this spiritual, historic, and divine journey. We know that trees are life, trees are hope, trees are amazing communicators and teachers, medicinal healers and connectors. So let's take care of the earth together. It is our home. And thank you for taking on this amazing topic and taking us all through this spiritual journey. Take it away, Amar.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you very much. Welcome to all the participants from different parts of the world. While the screen share is being done, I just want to share with you that I was born, brought up, and educated in India, spent most of my time in Australia, but also Denmark, South Africa, and different parts of the world. So what is it like being born and brought up in India? When I was growing up, there were lots of trees around. People lived in traditional houses. And at the back of the house was always a basil plant, tulasi, as you can see right in front of you in the middle. And there's a little alcove to light a lamp at the bottom. And this is the kind of basil tree pot that we were all used to growing up with. This would be right at the back of the house, but as you enter the house from the front door, you could see right through the way the houses were designed according to the traditional text. Is that you should be able to see the tulasi plant. It's the most sacred plant. And so as children, in the backyard brushing our teeth, we would then eat some of the leaves of this plant. Now, of course, it's become very common for people who are pursuing health, routines to eat tulsi plant in the morning. But this is something we used to do once upon a time. And there were always trees all around on the first day of the new year, because the new year, according to the lunar calendar, sometimes for us was in March or April, like it's commonly in other parts of the region called Nowruz, or the New Year, right from Turkey to Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, it's called Nowruz, the New Year. Many people in North America, Europe, and elsewhere celebrate Nowruz as the New Year. And Nowruz is a celebration of the New Year centers around very much, the environment. And where we grew up, our uncles would put swings across trees, and women, especially young women, would use the swings, sing songs. But those of us, boys who were below a certain age, we were also allowed to come and enjoy. So we grew up with trees with a cultural dimension, a very strong cultural dimension, but also a spiritual dimension, as you see right in the middle of your screen. Uh, but on the left-hand side, what you see, why we're using that image is most of us only see the tree as what we can see on top of the soil, but underneath the soil is a huge root system. The older the tree, the bigger the root system. And this becomes central when we talk about carbon sequestration and within the context of climate change and what's happening to the world with climate crisis, COVID-19, the current pandemic. Carbon sequestration is very important with the Paris Climate Accord. So we need to understand not only trees above the ground, but also their longevity, continuity, and underneath the soil as well. So that's why I chose these two slides for the first, to kickstart the discussion. Sonia, if that's okay with you. Okay, let's move on. Next, we come to, banyan tree is very common in India. It's also common in Australia. It was introduced during colonial times. It's common in many parts of Africa, many other parts of the world. Banyan trees like this one can be, centuries old. But why I chose this particular image is not because of the magnificence of the banyan tree, not because of its historical location in so many cultures, not because it's being, venerated in many ways, but simply because if you go to the earliest Sanskrit text in India, called Rig Veda, there are 4 Vedas, texts of knowledge. The earliest is Rig Veda, dating back to about 1500 BC. Remember, they were oral texts, so they were written down much later. But based on textual analysis, Indologists date the Rig Veda to 1500 BC. The teacher in the Rig Veda asked the student to bring him out the nut, the seed of a banyan tree. So the student brings the seed. Then the teacher asks the student to break it open. And he breaks it open. He says, "What do you see in there?" And he says, "Nothing." And then the teacher says, "But out of that nothingness is this greatness of the banyan tree that grows." That's what knowledge is about. So as we think of trees and our spiritual engagement, we got to think of the enormous context of knowledge, the spiritual dimension, health and well-being. And just like the student said, there was nothing in the banyan seed. And the teacher said, but out of that nothingness, the greatness of the banyan tree is. Similarly, out of the nothingness, the greatness, of the world, has evolved. So as we move on, by the time of the later Vedas, by 6th century BC, a lot of what is present-day Gangetic Valley, the whole river system of the Ganges, where nearly half the population of India lives, it was largely, deforested for agricultural purposes between 15th century BC and especially between 9th century BC and 6th century AD. and the god Agni. Agni is the fire god. So god Agni was often invoked, in the clearing of the land, so burning down the forest. So forest burning was a deliberate act to, to reclaim the lands or to have the land for agriculture, whatever. And forest fires are not something new. They're quite old, except in this context, they were man-made fires. However, forest fires can also have a very important can be part of land management system. If you look at the traditional knowledge system of Australian Aboriginal people, they used to do what was called by archaeologists fire stick farming. That means they actually systematically burned down the bush during the colder months. So, but when European colonizers came, they didn't understand the indigenous knowledge, nor did they respect it. So they didn't do the burning. So what do you see? I mean, just like in California, because the same practice was there with Native Americans, there's a lot published comparing Native American knowledge and practices and Australian Aboriginal knowledge and practices. California has had devastating fires. Australia has had devastating fires in the last 3 years. But before, the indigenous people used to manage the land by burning the bush, burning the shrubs underneath the trees during the cold season, so that the trees were protected, but the undergrowth was burned. So once again, burning the scrub is a way of protecting the trees and enabling their growth. And of course, the standard explanation in Australia is, you burn the undergrowth, you burn the bush, then the fresh shoots come, after the winter months, and the kangaroos come to, eat the fresh shoots, and then they were hunted and so on and so forth. That's a more rationalization, if you will. But there's far more than that, because the Aboriginal knowledge system was very deep. It's not that simplistic like anthropologists and archaeologists have explained. Same with Native Americans. It's very complex. It's only now being appreciated in North America. It's just like it's being appreciated even more in Australia now. So much so after the last set of bushfires in Australia, there's special funds, special programs made available by Aboriginal people to manage the trees, manage the bush, manage the landscape. So what you get is altered landscapes that keep changing too in this whole process. So just like that in 6th century BC, when all this land was reclaimed in what is now the Gangetic Valley, where more than 500 million, if 600 million people live, there were growth of many cities, rapid growth of urbanization, and a lot of intellectual ferment, a lot of rituals, but also a lot of rituals where animals were sacrificed. So the kind of materialism that we talked about in the 70s and 80s is very similar. The Upanishads, the contemporary texts, you find very similar kind of discourse about materialism and the importance of finding oneself through depth, through meditation. So what we find then is the tree takes a different symbolic significance with the advent of Buddhism. And in 6th century BC, there were many movements. I mean, usually they're attributed to 68 ways, the 68 movements, which include Buddhism, Jainism, and Ajivikas. These are the three most well-known ones. But Buddhism, of course, is very well known in the West and all over the world. And Buddha, who came from the Sakya clan, who was born on what is now present-day Nepal, and traveled across what is present-day northern India, most of the Gangetic Valley. He meditated underneath a peepal tree. And so as you can see in the slide in front of you, and he attained enlightenment under the tree. So as Buddhism spread as a way of life, not as a religion, because it didn't have initially for several centuries theology, and Buddha was not a god, but Buddhism was a way of life that was pursued. The tree became very symbolic. as you see in the carving on the right-hand side at the bottom, the tree became very symbolic because an iconic way of worshiping means Buddha's sandals were worshipped, Buddha's seat was worshipped, the tree under which he attained enlightenment was worshipped. So everything was symbolic. There's more than what you see when you look at the tree in terms of enlightenment. So then you get this whole series of variations as we move over the next 2,600 years, variations of trees of knowledge, and which take on different local meanings and contexts, including in places like Australia. Can you go back, Sharvari? Sharvari, go back, please. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and so what you find is this is Bodh Gaya. It's a World Heritage Site, and this is the tree. This is a tree that's continued over centuries, under which Buddha attained enlightenment. Saplings of this tree have been transplanted to many places. If you go to the Anuradhapura, the most sacred place in Sri Lanka, where Buddhism was introduced, the Bodhi tree, as it is called, the sapling was brought from the main tree in Bodh Gaya, which is where this tree is. So similarly, even where I was born, where Mahayana Buddhism, later form of Buddhism, where Buddha became, there was God and theology and all that, and our whole way of life changed into a new philosophy. His Holiness the Dalai Lama in 2006 brought a sapling from Bodh Gaya and planted it over there to celebrate the major ceremony called Kalachakra ceremony he performed. But then even these old trees are not stable because we have devastated the environment all around. Trees don't exist on their own. They exist in environment, forest, whatever you want to call. And so you can see on the right-hand side, the same tree, uprooted, but luckily stabilized afterwards. So trees are something to nurture. We plant them, but we need to nurture them. And I will give you an example how contemporary women do this in Amaravati. So women, next slide, please. Women play a very important role in conservation. First of all, on the left-hand side at the top, you see what are called sacred groves. There's considerable amount of research done. If you Google sacred groves, GROVES, you get a lot of case studies, material. UNESCO has sponsored a lot of research in this area. World Wildlife Fund has also sponsored a lot of research, but it's not only in India, you get them in elsewhere too, like the Kaya forests in Kenya and elsewhere. But with the advent of capitalism and colonialism and modernity, what you find is that there's more and more of deforestation because the capitalization of the culture. So what you find is that women in many parts of India, became very active in protecting trees by surrounding the trees, hugging. I know in the West, tree hugging sometimes is derogatory, but let me tell you, it's not derogatory. It is the women's connection with the earth and her caring for earth. And in traditional Indian philosophy, Shakti, the power of the woman, is extremely important. It's non-dual. That means there's no male, no female principle, but the female principle is the most powerful. So the trees that are protected in the sacred groves, in the forest, with the deforestation that's taking place, and the role of women, as you see here, is very significant. So there's a direct connection between women and their femininity, the power of the Shakti, and the trees and the conservation of the trees. That's really very important. And you find the same thing in Australia too. There are many trees that Europeans just didn't understand their importance. They just cut them down And some of those trees that have been cut down because they got carvings on them, you find them in European museums. And there's a move to document them, repatriate them back to Australia. Because a lot of those trees were not just canoe trees where canoe bark was removed. They were secret and sacred because this is where young people were initiated. And both men, and especially the men in New South Wales where the trees were taken away from, but women also were initiated elsewhere. So the trees are significant spiritually for indigenous communities, not only in Australia, also in India, in North America, elsewhere in the world. They're very significant for secret and sacred business. So women's connection and the spiritual connection to trees and conservation of trees is extremely important. And we have to keep thinking about this when we think about planting trees. Well, it is a spiritual journey. It's a spiritual journey for thousands of years. And we'll now move on to Sharvari, next slide, please. Now, I deliberately picked this. This is Amaravati. This is the birthplace of Mahayana Buddhism. Now, some of you might ask me, what is the difference between Theravada, or the original form of Buddhism, and Mahayana Buddhism? Because if you look at the most popular form of Buddhism in the world, in fact, the largest faith in the world before the Cultural Revolution in China is Mahayana Buddhism. You find it in China, Japan, Korea, all over the Himalayas, different kingdoms, Tibet, you name it. And the fastest growing faith in Australia is Mahayana Buddhism, according to the last Australian Bureau of Statistics. But yet this is a place, where that philosophy evolved. And what is the difference? In Theravada Buddhism, what you find is whether you're laity, whether you're a monk or nun, your dedication to a sacred place is for your personal, knowledge, for your personal merit, if you will. Because remember, all of us are potential Buddhas, male, female, all of us are potential Buddhas. So within that framework, everybody was finding their own middle path, searching for their own approach to nirvana, if you will. But by the time Mahayana Buddhism took birth between 1st century BC and 1st century AD, here in this place where it started as Madhyamika philosophy, what happened is that, the rapid growth of materialism, people wanted to make donations, but also for the greater good of the society. In Mahayana Buddhism, you make the donations for your family, for the greater good of the society, but not necessarily for yourself. But then it is already accepted that in order to become a future Buddha, you have to go through many lives. And they are the stories of bodhisattvas, the different lives of Buddhahood, to reach Buddhahood, if you will. But what is the significance of this place that I'm showing you? It's a marketplace. It's a fruit and vegetable market that you typically find in all villages in South India. This is in Amaravati. The tree you see in front of you fell down in a cyclone in 1977, and it's reestablished itself again. It's quite big. And there's some what look like dolls. You see a doll in front of it. That's a mother goddess associated with the tree. But this used to be the edge of the village. Like so many places in India, they're called santas. And they are village fairs. That means your fruit and vegetable market across India in the traditional villages was rarely in the village. It was at the edge of the village. Why? The farmers would bring the vegetables. They would set up the marketplace over there at regular times during the day when it's not hot, in the mornings, evenings, and so on and so forth. And this used to be outside Amaravati, the village of Amaravati. Now, of course, the village has spread beyond this. This is where they used to stop. But the trees were important because where they set up the stalls, where they got together from the villages, the shade of the trees, but also the worshipping the trees, like you see that little mother goddess doll, is fairly significant because the spirituality associated with a place where you're selling food is also quite significant. Now, if you think of farmers coming, so sort of to the edge of the village, it used to happen all over the world. It used to happen in North America too. And one of the classic examples that I saw after freedom in South Africa, in post-apartheid South Africa, when I was working there, is the fruit and vegetable market outside Pretoria in South Africa. If you go in the morning about 4:30 to 5 outside to the marketplace, all the wagons and trucks of the farmers will come. They'll reverse in a horseshoe shape. So you go and purchase what you want, including the farmer's wife's delicacy that she would make called cook sister, which is an amazing sweet that only South Africans know how important it is. It's an important part of their culture. So there again, trees are important in terms of shade. Otherwise, during the daytime, there's not much that happens. So I worked on protecting this tree and the surrounding area, that whole market area, so that we do not forget the ways that we lived once upon a time and the importance of continuing some of our village lives. Okay, next please. Next slide, Srisha. No, go, yeah. Now, this is another very important tree, banyan tree. I don't have a full shot deliberately here. You see a mother goddess at the bottom to the right-hand side, right? Her name is Balasulamma Talli. So the whole area is called Balasulamma Talli Gudi, or temple. Gudi means temple in Telugu. And so she's a mother goddess, but she was stolen. She was stolen because of illicit traffic is quite there all over the world, in India too. She was stolen in the antique market, antique trade. But the guy who stole it and took it to Hyderabad to sell it, within the same week, his brother died, his brother-in-law died, and his father died. 3 people died in his family in the same week. So he got very scared and he brought it back and threw it in a field just behind the tree. So the pujari here is not a Brahmin, is a potter, comes from the potter's caste. He found it and he reinstated her. So what we did was we stabilized everything around the temple and we reanimated the place that was dilapidated for a variety of reasons. 23 villages, people from 23 villages come together here. So what is the significance of the tree? Like when a baby is born on the 21st day or 23rd day, the baby is usually put in a swing, right? So what did the parents do? They come to the temple, they make an offering to the mother goddess, then they tie up a sari from the tree and they use the sari as a swing and they put the baby for the first time in the swing. That's the first time that the grandparents, especially the mother's parents, they look at the baby and they give the baby jewelry, all kinds of things, which is part of what we call parampara, or intergenerational transmission that's passed on from generation to generation. But also it's underneath this huge banyan tree that's in the background. Everybody who's sitting there is within the shade of the tree that you can see at the back. The women on the left-hand side who are cooking. Right-hand side, there's some women out dealing with children. And here is an elderly gentleman from Amaravati, explaining to young people about the significance of spirituality and trees, why trees need to be protected. And underneath this tree, once a year, they have what is called Jatra. They get tens of thousands of people come here to visit the mother goddess, sit around the tree. There's all kinds of folk life, village theater, all these things we call intangible heritage now is practiced around this tree. So once again, the tree is also symbolic for, for the newborn baby. This tree is symbolic for the newborn couple because they come here, they make offerings. And in the old days, when people bought a new bullock or new buffalo for milk or cow for milk, they would bring it to the mother goddess and ask her to bless the cow, and the cow or buffalo or bullock was tied under the tree. But these days, what do people bring? They bring motorbikes and everything and park them there. and ask the mother goddess to bless their motorbikes. But the life has changed with young middle class people. But there is a kind of association with the tree, the banyan tree. So we protected 29 such trees as part of a major central government program to protect the heritage of 12 places in India, and one of them happened to be Amaravati. Next slide, please. Now, this is a Kuchipudi performance by young women, both local but also coming from outside. And this is inside the Amar Lingeshwar temple. Amar Lingeshwar temple is one of the most sacred sites to Shiva in South India. It's the most visited among the 5 sacred places to Shiva. And on any given day, before the pandemic, you would get about 100,000 people a day. And on one occasion, 270,000. Why? What does it mean in the village? The village has only a population of 17,000 people. But in this period, there's all kinds of performances that take place. And here women performing what we call Raitu Rajula. That means the king that supported before the Europeans came. The whole of South India was under the Vijayanagar Empire. And it's the Vijayanagar king who came here. He came to this temple. In fact, the performance is in front of the built environment he created. And they're performing the story, how he created water systems. This emperor, Vijayanagar emperor, Sri Krishna Deva, one of the most famous. There's so much written about the wealth of the empire. That's why the Europeans came to India, because of the wealth. And they're performing this, but look at the trees in the background. Again, so in the daytime, you would have trees all around this place. And in fact, as part of in 2016, we planted 200 more trees in this whole area around the temple. But you got to remember, the temple is not just about the god alone. The temple is about values. The tree planting is about a value system, about safeguarding our environment, and providing for sustainability and catering future generations. Okay, next. After this, what I wanted to show is a slide of an artwork that I got today from a young 6-year-old celebrating World Environment Day. Her mother is a museologist, and she posted it in social media. What young people, because what she has drawn, this young 6-year-old living in Calcutta, which is one of the biggest cities in the world, what she has drawn is actually a rural atmosphere, that longing for farms, vegetables, and so on and so forth. So there's a whole younger generation that is very conscious of the importance of trees. They're being brought up by their mothers, with some spiritual values associated with trees. And that's the next generation. I think that we should celebrate that today, because after all, sustainability is what we leave for the next generation, so they can support themselves. As it's the whole Brundtland Commission report, if you will. But Sonia, I think we'll stop there because of, and if there are any questions, maybe you might want to start off. I think I can see you were making some notes.
Yes, thank you, Amar. No, that was, absolutely fascinating. And I agree with you that really what today does celebrate is the future, insofar as, although we didn't see the slide of the drawing of the young child, I think there are so many efforts to reconnect the next generations to Mother Nature, to the earth, so that they understand and that they communicate with nature, and so take responsibility for what happens to our home, to our planet. So you mentioned many interesting things, Amar. I wanted you to tell us a little bit about that governmental program you mentioned in passing, about 29 trees I'd love to hear more about what that is.
Yeah, thank you, Sonia. That's a very important question. I really appreciate it. Um, the central government had a program uh, of urban regeneration, but also pilgrimage, development of pilgrimage sites. And Amaravati is a pilgrimage site. So as part of that, the funding came to provide road infrastructure, water infrastructure, tourism infrastructure, pilgrimage infrastructure, and so on. But what it didn't specifically say is trees.
Hmm.
But then I was the curator at that time in the village of the whole village as an eco museum. And I think you've given me an opportunity how we introduced the idea of an eco museum in the whole of India. It's fairly new. It's very common in Quebec. You get that in US, Norway, quite common. It's a francophone concept from France, ecomuseology, and very popular in China. And so what we did was, look, how do you bring people and their heritage together in a pilgrimage place, which is both significant for Mahayana Buddhism, but also for worship of Shiva. So people need to walk between places, right? So we created a heritage walk. We planted trees. We
Beautiful.
safeguarded the old trees that were already there. Why we safeguarded the old trees was very simple. When we did a cultural mapping exercise, what the old people said is the trees are important for them because they get out of the house in the evenings and they sit underneath these trees and they talk. When they're sitting there and they're talking, the children are playing, on the side. So there's a whole intergenerationality, the kind of thing that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross talks about, sort of that we should bring, creches and old people's nursing homes together. In fact, she got that concept and idea from India. She's written about it, how she found it, that these traditional values are very important and that we should, learn about this. And she was a very good advocate for this. So this is actually the trees were the central places where the old people would sit there and the young people, children would be playing all around. Well, the parents, could be coming back from the farms, could be doing household chores, making dinners, whatever. But the old people are enjoying themselves. But the trees are central to this. We had 29 trees like this in a small village. And these are fairly big trees. So what I did was I used it as an opportunity to see how the government money could be used to put, slate floors all around the trees to make them safer for children, but also that road infrastructure was developed to make it safer for the old people and the children. So, I mean, briefly, it's, the governments can give you money, but you got to be, smart. I mean, we like to talk about smart cities, but when we talk about smart cities, we're always talking in digital infrastructure. That's not being very smart. But what we were doing was being smart with the money that we're trying to create an environment, an atmosphere that Palluturi Vatavaranam. Vatavaranam means atmosphere, village atmosphere. How do we recreate the village atmosphere? So people don't just come to see the Buddhist stupa or the temple, but they actually come to enjoy something in the cities. It's very difficult to find in India.
So thank you for that, Amar. That's really clear. I'm struck by the fact that you really are a cultural advocate for Indigenous people and the Indigenous wisdom that you mentioned, especially vis-a-vis the Australian bushfires, cannot be underestimated. And I would love for you to share some stories from your experience where the Indigenous wisdom vis-a-vis nature, tree planting, and the future really of environmentalism, how that dovetails well together.
Thank you again, Sonia. I'll go to Australia first, because
Super.
in the mid 80s, from 84, 85 till about 92, I was the director of National Affirmative Action Program in Australia for Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islanders, you name it, museums, galleries, libraries, archives, World Heritage Sites, national parks. And because at that time, believe it or not, in 1984-85, there were 14,600 people on full pay in a small country like Australia, population-wise, very small population, and but no Aboriginal people. And yet, statistically, 1/3 of Australia's tourism economy is dependent upon Aboriginal culture. And ecotourism, sort of based on Aboriginal knowledge systems, Aboriginal experience, but they were not benefiting. So one of the very first things we did was run a year-long training program by young Aboriginal rangers, 32 of them, in Kakadu National Park, which is a World Heritage Site, but working with old people, not park rangers going off parachuting and telling them what to do, but actually working with old people so that they can pass on the knowledge, how they have looked after the land for thousands, tens of thousands of years in Australia. So the old people passed on the knowledge to the young people. And of course, the park rangers, Balanda White Park Rangers also shared their knowledge. So it was the best of both the worlds. But in this process, one of the things that the old people said was, you don't understand the bush. And when this happened, there were some Japanese tourists who were listening to them. So the park ranger, without mentioning the name, he was quite embarrassed that in front of tourists, that he was told that they don't understand the land. And so he said, no, we'll talk later on, try to shoo them off, The Japanese were very upset. They said to the park ranger, shh, listen, you must listen to people. You must listen to old people. I mean, it was phenomenal because the park ranger and his team realized, hey, look, there's something here. I mean, they were really nice people trying to do the right thing. They're not just white people, they're more than very committed white people. But the Japanese tourists provided the turning point where people realized, look, there is something here. And the Japanese tourists were very firm that they want to listen to the Aboriginal people, they don't want to listen to the rangers. And so that led to many things and many kinds of studies. A wonderful American called Nancy Williams edited a volume on this, on how Aboriginal people in Australia, Indigenous people in North America, Native Americans in the US, actually work with the bush, with the trees, whether it's burning to manage them. Fire-stick farming, as it's sometimes called by archaeologists. And so it started off, that kind of 1985-86 turning point for both Australia and United States, for both, in that recognition of indigenous knowledge systems. And now indigenous people world over, some of the most vulnerable people, they've been custodians of Earth for tens of thousands of years. If anybody understands, remember the definition, common law definition of ownership is, in non-indigenous world, we say we own land, right? We own land. We have legal title. But in indigenous worldview, they belong to the land. They don't own the land. They belong to the land. That's a big difference. So if you take that ownership that we belong to the land, it would make a huge difference in the way we protect our trees, forests, and the environment. That's from Australia, the story. But in India, there are many sacred groves where local people have protected them. It's not just indigenous people. If you go to Kerala, non-indigenous people also protect sacred groves, but they are micro environments of species that they're protecting. It's a sacred value that's attributed to them in India. Same with the Kaya forest in Kenya. There's a sacred value that's attributed. Everybody knows about Wangari Maathai, who planted 1 million trees. She won the Nobel Prize for Peace. But what people think is only trees. She always said one thing, it's the culture behind. It's not just the trees. You got to understand the cultural context of tree planting that has got a spiritual and sacred value. So all over the world, I think this is really important. Thank you for asking that question.
Yeah, I think this mantra really should be concretized all over the world. We belong to the land. I love that so much. And I think what fascinates me about your story and what I'd like to underscore is the power of the people, right? So here we have, Japanese tourists, everyone can play a major role in creating a turning point. And maybe today someone will do just that.
Yeah, yeah. I think given the climate crisis, the kind of triangulation that we're seeing between the climate crisis, COVID situation, and Black Lives Matter, I think we need a paradigm shift in the way we engage. And I'm just looking at the Q&A box. Harish, I don't think it was meant in any bad way that power issues are there. I'm in Ahmedabad and I'm struggling, because of whatever has happened. I can tell you in Australia too, I've encountered it during cyclones, and so on and so forth. It's all over. So you're absolutely right. All Indian villages today stand electrified. That's not the question. Yeah, we are electrified. That's really wonderful. You point that out, Harish Mehta. But the thing is that power cuts have become common for a variety of reasons, not because of, we don't have power connections. But right now we're going through one. I'm using a battery to light myself up here and a hotspot on my phone to continue talking. And uh, then you ask about, Harish, you ask about educative, about, they're not the, forest fires, they're different types of fires. To reclaim land for agriculture, that was once upon a time. And it's being done now. You're absolutely right. It's being done in the most devastating way of destroying, prime forest, which is totally unethical, unnecessary. It's capitalist greed, basically, in my opinion. And but I was talking about it in a historical context of the sedentarization of northern India. Um, and then there's Dr. Roman Matana Soni uh, I think from Kuwait. She's asking about native trees. This is really important. When we talk about afforestation, one of the important things that all scientists point out, all indigenous point out, is don't introduce alien species. You know, study, understand, know your local botany, and contextualize your tree plantation. So much so, when I was working in South Africa, I was quite amused. The quintessential Australian blue gum, which is an eucalyptus tree, which is typical of Australian landscape, which was introduced during the colonial times into South Africa, was declared a national weed. They were getting rid of the blue gum in South Africa because it is not from South Africa. And it was soaking up all the water from other trees, destroying the moisture in the landscapes and so on. So you're absolutely right. I think that we need to think in terms of what tree plantation are we doing? Are there local species? What kind of interventions can be made? Uh, and yeah, there's another question. Yeah. Oh, yes. Thank you, Dhanakar. You're absolutely right. There's your medical college. In fact, a professor from your medical college was on the webinar on Shakti too. It's amazing that your medical college takes into consideration, the indigenous knowledge systems. I wish all medical colleges do that in India and elsewhere. In Australia, the University of Newcastle has established an indigenous faculty to take into consideration indigenous knowledge, whether it's to do with culture, health, and well-being, whether it's land management, whether it's trees, you name it. And yeah, and your comment is right that for Baudhu Purnima Vaishakhi, the people tree, the Bodhi tree is decorated and so on. Is there any difference between, this is from Vietnam, question, is there any difference between land ownership between men and women in India? Technically, no. but in reality, patriarchy is very much there. Because of patriarchy, land ownership is very much, the power is very much in the hands of men. I know some people will disagree with that, but even in the case of the Devadasis, the so-called temple dancers, because they were the custodians of all our classical dances in India until it was made illegal by what we call Macaulay's children, that is, the bureaucrats trained in the British tradition, that after India got independence on the 14th of October, 1947, a law was introduced in Madras Presidency, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Andhra covered, that making the Devadasi system illegal, whereas they were not sex workers. That was the misconception, lack of understanding of local knowledge and thinking things from outside. They were not at all. They're in fact the custodians of the classical dances, music and dance. But the land was, they were matrilineal. So land went through women, managed by the temples or by trusts, whatever. But the land was always through the women. They were matrilineal. But this legislation very quickly, let the patriarchy take over. What was matrilineal was decimated. So land ownership is quite complicated in that sense. My sad thing about it that when women had that matrilineality, they were far more conscious of the significance of trees and their sacred value and the rituals for which they use them, for a variety of rituals, that they use them. And I think that as we go for tree planting, we got to talk to the elderly local women, talk to them about the spiritual value that is so important as we do the planting. Now we have a question here from Mexico. Crystal, look, we're going to switch over because my Wi-Fi has come back. I'm sorry.
Wonderful. No, it's terrific.
It automatically switches over. There's nothing I can do.
It's very
good. Can you hear me, Sonia?
We can hear you really well, Amar. Yeah. Hear you well.
But it will switch over. It'll take 5 seconds to switch over. So, Gracel, thank you so much. Hope you're safe in Mexico. She's very much involved. Just a reminder that by restoring only 15% of ecosystems in priority areas can cut extinctions by 60%, according to the recently released report of United Nations Environmental Program. Food and Agricultural Organization synthesis report marking the launch of the decade on ecosystem restoration. Fantastic. I wouldn't say fantastic, shameful that we actually reached this stage, but this is great that this is happening. Thanks for sharing that, Rachel. And of course, I lost power again.
You're still with us. We hear you well and see you well.
Yeah, and so thank you for bringing that to our notice. And so please check out UNEP website for restoration of people, nature, and climate. And like for why I'm doing this webinar with Green Sakthi is they've planted 1.6 million trees. Their ambition is to plant 5 million trees. These 5 million trees, they're appropriately planted in Tamil Nadu, near Vellore, near the Pidam. That's exactly what you're talking about. In fact, those 5 million trees could make a huge difference. Yeah, and just imagine if this was multiplied elsewhere, how this would be. So thank you, Gracel, very much appreciated. And let me put down the battery because I can't see the question and answer box otherwise. Yeah, and yes, absolutely, indigenous species, the seeds, because one of the important things that I learned in South Africa is through the National Agricultural Museum. When your seeds are local, they're indigenous seeds, they're far more resistant to all kinds of diseases and everything. They're far more resistant because they've been hardened for thousands of years. So indigenous seed is very important, as been pointed out. And then from Mauritius, there's a question from Mauritius. In many underdeveloped countries, trees need to be cut to bring economic development. Sorry, this is a myth of development lobby groups. You don't have to cut down trees to bring economic development. It's a question of appropriate, development and understanding indigenous knowledge systems. So the rest of your question, yeah, she's raised a number of issues that center around this figment of the imagination of the neo-capitalist opportunists who want to cut down the trees for development. Sorry, I don't agree with that. Then somebody has asked importance of sacred groves. Sacred groves are biodiversity niches. Sacred groves are also important for rituals, ceremonies, for well-being. Remember, sacred groves are, let me put it this way. Before the Judeo-Christian notion of nature culture was introduced into India, and there was no nature culture binary. Like we say Bhumata in India, that means Mother Earth. Do you say Mother Earth is nature or culture? For us, it's one and the same. There is no that dichotomy. And I think one of the first things we need to get rid of is this colonial binary. What was really interesting is in the 2002 Rio Plus 10 Johannesburg World Summit on Sustainable Development that the South African President Thabo Mbeki chaired, African countries and Asian countries came together. They said, look, we got to get rid of this nature culture binary, and they're very emphatic that we take a holistic approach. Otherwise, the Western idea or colonial idea rather, because I think a lot of people in West are doing excellent work of conservation, but the colonial idea that nature is something to be raped and cultivated and exploited still prevails in many places as long as we have this nature culture dichotomy. And so we need to have a blended approach, as somebody is pointing out. And blended approach, yes, we can't go back. No culture is frozen in time. So we're all moving forward as we go along. So it's a question of taking a blended approach, being, conscious of what we're doing to the environment, being dedicated to environmental rehabilitation, understanding tree planting is not just about what you see above what you plant, but that first slide that I showed you, what is underneath and what is the importance of carbon sequestration in tree planting has to be understood. Yes, there's a comment that the Sundarbans, which have been very badly damaged, but they're now on the World Heritage List. Hopefully that brings certain conservation measures to the Sundarbans. They were all developed into canals, during the colonial times, and the spread of malaria, and then that's continued afterwards as well. So the question is being asked, what can be the role of sacred groves today? Oh, absolutely. That's a very good question. I think, I gave you that little example of the tulasi or basil plant in the very first slide. One little plant, which is a sacred value, I said sacred value. It has an impact on the everyday life of that family in that house. So sacred groves protected, microenvironments with secret and sacred value, with biodiversity reserves. They could be the storehouses of endangered species. They could be the storehouses of indigenous seeds. They could be storehouses of plants from which we can take saplings to spread species that have been wiped out in our villages. So there are many opportunities there, but also it brings in some sense of spirituality, to the whole idea of tree planting, the whole idea of protecting trees. So we got quite a range of people here. Narrative, which it's educated, but forest fires to reclaim. No, we've gone back. Sorry, I don't know why we went back. Sorry, I'm trying to come to you, Nivedita.
Amar, Nivedita, how the museum acts as a technological vehicle for community engagement in this spiritual journey.
Fantastic. That's a very, very good comment that museums can, not just technological, but as environmental agencies. Museums are about, the knowledge that we research, we generate, we communicate, and we present. In that journey, natural history museums play a very important role, but really all museums, I don't want to say natural history museums because that's a category, but all museums have a very important journey to role to play. I just want to give one example, if it's okay, Sonia, because now that Nivedita has raised it, I still remember when I look at a lot of young people, I know that we are struggling with cultural amnesia. We forget all the good things that we have learned. We try to reinvent the wheel. So I'm just saying that when the National Museum of Natural History, which unfortunately burned down about 6-7 years ago, when it was established, what Dr. Nair, the founding director, did was fantastic. What he did was he got all the newspapers in India to come to party at no cost, and they had a national advertisement for drawings, essays by school children, high school children, college children, and they had over 200,000 essays they collected from all over India in the National Museum of Natural History. They collected a lot of ideas and to build that concept of the National Museum of Natural History. So a museum played an important role in raising the awareness through newspapers, through the children. And we copied it in Halong Bay when I was working in Vietnam. I lived in Halong Bay for a couple of years. What we did was we did exactly the same thing. We worked with all the school children, primary school children to do drawings, secondary school children to write essays, and college students to write essays, simply called My Home, My Halong. That means Halong Bay is where I live, right? So my home, my Halong. That was the theme of how we crowdsource ideas about environmentalism and environmental conservation in Halong Bay, which is on the World Heritage List for its aesthetic and landscape values, but also its geological and scientific values. It was a focal point for establishing the club of the most beautiful bays in the world. And believe me, I've been to a lot of these bays. This is the most beautiful bay. It needs to be protected, and local people, so awareness was raised through the museum education program of the Eco Museum. My dear Nathalie Latham has asked me a question. How could she not ask me a question? My French Australian friend who lives in India. Do you personally feel spirits in trees? I do, Nathalie. I know I'm a highly educated person, and I'm an atheist. I'm very rational about everything. But when I sit underneath that banyan tree near Balsalama Taligudi, that I showed earlier on with the elderly Subbarao sitting there and talking, sometimes I go and sit there in the evenings there, Natalie, all by myself. And I feel a presence. I feel a presence. It's the village atmosphere. It's the beautiful breeze from the fields, rice fields. It's the river bank of the river Krishna. And the mother goddess, right next to me in the little shrine. There's a presence of the tree. Somehow I feel that particular tree is more than 200 years old. Many people have sat underneath it. Many people have conducted rituals underneath it. And I believe in the spirit of the place. So I do feel it. I do feel it. And I've experienced this with the Aboriginal elders when I was camping with them. They would say, sit down, Waku. Waku means son. You sit down. That means you just sit down, right? You listen to the elders and you just feel the breeze. You feel the trees. I'm not just talking about Arnhem Land. I'm talking about Central Australia. In the desert, you sit next to a tree in the shade and you suddenly feel, a kind of spirit. Natalie, there's an old saying in Tajganj near Taj Mahal. This saying, it's a Muslim saying, very wise. It says, to those who believe, no proof is necessary. To those who don't believe, all proof is unnecessary. So I believe, it's a matter of belief. I believe, and I do feel the spirit in the trees. And the next one is, are there significant seed banks in India? Yes, there are. And they're important. They're very significant seed banks, not only for rice and wheat, but also for mangoes. Not many people know that mangoes come from India. And there are nearly 630 varieties of mangoes. It was during the it is the Buddhist monks who introduced mangoes outside India, because they introduced betel nut, doma, because you chew on the raw betel nut. It helps you to meditate, raw betel nut. Mango, it's very easy to carry the seed and plant it wherever you go. So mango is a full meal. I mean, before diabetes and sedentary life, mangoes were considered the complete meal. So and then during the colonial times, the British introduced them in Fiji, everywhere. Australia till 1960s. Adelaide used to import mangoes exclusively from India, but since then Queensland has planted mangoes everywhere. Queensland produces some amazing, beautiful mangoes now. Okay, I'm going to take questions from people who haven't had a chance to ask questions. Okay, there are a lot of questions. Yeah, well, Fatima Santo, Espirito Santo, you're absolutely right. If you learn to listen, trees do talk to us. And unfortunately, none of our schools, none of our universities teach us the competency of listening. So we don't listen to our elders. We don't listen to our teachers. We don't listen to our gurus. We don't listen to anybody. We are not taught how to listen. But when you listen to trees, it almost feels like they talk to you, because it's a meditative space. When you're with trees, when you're sitting under a banyan tree, it is meditation. Remember Buddha, he meditated under the peepal tree. Maybe the tree was talking to him. Who knows? Trees do talk, but the thing is, we need that kind of space, that atmosphere, that presence, to understand that spiritual essence. I'm not talking religious, I'm talking about spiritual, because I'm very spiritual, but I'm not religious. And so I feel that deep sense of spirituality, when I go through a forest, when I go sit under any of the banyan trees. Sometimes in Australia, I just sit and get into my car. I just drive out into the bush and I find a nice cluster of trees. I get out, I spread a blanket and I just lie down and look at the billowing branches. And there's something so soothing about trees. I mean, all these healing properties, and I myself, I cannot mention the exact names of the two places that I was involved in for mental health and to protect the people there. But in both the places, I advocated that people shouldn't be locked up. They should be allowed to lie down under trees. They should be allowed to lie, to breathe. If you lock them up, you give them drugs, you punish them, which is what they do in a lot of mental health homes. I know some are good, but most are really atrocious, in my opinion. And but if you let people walk in nature, if you let people be one with nature, there's a healing. I mean, how often do we listen to elders? And why is that when a scientist comes and tells us gardening is good for you? Because when you put your fingers in the dirt, the neurons through your fingers, the bare fingers, the neurons through your bare fingers, the neurons go to your brain, and it's good for the health of your brain. I mean, this is scientifically established, it's published in major science journals. So suddenly, gardening has got a scientific value. Hey, what about permaculture? What about traditional agriculture? What about all the knowledge that's associated with looking after our forests, our sacred groves? All of those also are to do with health and well-being. And I think that it's really important. Tree planting needs to be understood for culture, health, and well-being. you know, whether it's in Australia, India, we have very high percentage of people who struggle with mental health issues. In India, it's very high. During the pandemic, nobody talks about them. Can you imagine how trapped they are, where the support is for them during the pandemic? And so trees are very, very good for mental health. Remember, I said, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. There's a spirituality, there's an essence. Tree is an essence. You know, it has an essence of years. It has witnessed so much. You want to ask for witnesses of history, but the greatest witnesses are trees. They're the only living beings that are witnesses, sometimes more than hundreds of years. There are no other witnesses. We go to archives, research, and everything, you know, but the real witnesses are trees of history.
Just to your point, Amar, I just want to chime in. When I think about Green Sakthi and what we do, it's this experience of caring for nature from an early age, right, during childhood, so that as an adult, you will love and protect nature. You will protect nature for a lifetime. So important to make sure that we start these programs, you know, in early childhood education, because that hands-on experience, that planting and maintaining trees, that joy of gardening, that's where we establish it.
Go on, Sonia, explain a bit more. That's brilliant.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's this idea of nurturing, this philosophy, I think, is essential. If you do not establish this kind of relationship early on, it's much more difficult. I think that's why we have the problems that we have today, because we are so disassociated from nature from an early age. And it is essential to establish these types of education programs all over the world so that we adopt this philosophy, so that we adopt the mantra that you spoke of earlier, which is, we belong to the land.
Yep. So eloquent, Sonia. That's so eloquent, so true. And so, you know, all knowledge becomes not relevant if you're not conscious of our own sense of place and identity where we are. If we don't respect our Mother Earth, who else will we respect? And I think that in what I've seen in many parts, I'll give you an example from San Antonio in Belize. I've worked in different parts of the world, literally on every continent. The Garcia sisters are very famous. These are Mayans. San Antonio is a Mayan place. And they love me because I'm 2 times their height. They just love me. But what happened is the Garcia sisters were so conscious that their indigenous knowledge of the Mayans was being lost, because the men were, remember, in a lot of indigenous societies before the colonial people came, the men came, there was a different kind of value system. Like if you take Australia, one of the things that I learned very early from Aboriginal people, especially Aboriginal women, is that, you know, there's men's business, there's women's business, there's something called everybody's business, which is gossip, and something called nobody's business, that's secret and sacred stuff. So everything, I think, can you hear me? Because it's switching over.
Yes, we're with you.
So before the interaction, like I can tell you from Andhra Pradesh, where I know the tribal communities, that the forestry departments are often by men. It's only now you start getting women. Until now, women were mainly typists and secretaries in the offices, not forestry officers, even though some of the most brilliant botany, biology students come out of colleges are women. Because boys are too busy taking on economics, accounting, you know, all those things to make more money. Women care. Women take I mean, I'm not saying this right now, but I've always said ever since I've been teaching for 43 years that I always found that women in the classroom were far more sensitive far more conservation conscious. I'm not saying men are not. Men are also conservation conscious, but very often I found that women are conservation conscious. So what happened with the Garcia sisters is they found that because of this colonial interaction for men, remember the white man only talks to the black man, right? Black, not the black woman, because the colonial white man boss talks to black man. So suddenly where there was a parity in rights, between men and women, suddenly men became more important. So suddenly you become more British than the British, more white than the white people, like in India. A lot of aspirational people try to be that in India. Something that they're not, sort of, this is something that the Kwakwatul in British Columbia also say, that we shouldn't try to be something that we are not. So the men were trying to do that. So the women were really concerned that once the old people go, so much of the mind knowledge will go to deal with seeds, with plants, with wood, properties of wood and everything. So the sisters asked their husbands if they could build them huts. So they built them thatched huts. And so all the 5 huts became museums. So my role was to, when there, not only to give feedback, but also somebody, a member of parliament who had I'm sorry, Sonia, girlfriend from New York.
That's all right.
She,
Lots of girlfriends in New York.
parachuted there, and she said, "Oh my God, these are amazing. We should commercialize. They could make so much money." And the women protested. They said, "No, we did this to pass on the knowledge to the next generation," or like the way Sonia eloquently said, to bring up the children with the knowledge, to pass it on to the next generation. So they they wanted help because they were being exploited. They're going to be kicked out of their lands. So what I did was, there's a Native American law foundation in New York, and I knew the principal there. So I contacted her and connected, and I said, here is a challenge. So the money was raised in New York for the whole case, and the whole thing was exposed. And the Mind sisters are able to protect their knowledge, that the way they're doing it, passing it on. And so caring with young people, children, sacred groves could be very important educational sites, trees and environments. Chipko movement, of course. I mean, I showed a picture of the Chipko movement. Somebody, asked that question. I mean, that is significant movement, of women, also men. And okay, somebody is asking about coral reefs, mangroves, are the rainforests of the seas and oceans, and ocean food shelter provide. Absolutely. In Vietnam, in Halong Bay, what we found is that because of coal mining, because the French were in Vietnam because of coal, because 91% of coal came from Kampha in the backyard of Halong Bay. So the French were there because of coal. It was part of the Yunnan province. And because of all the coal dust from transporting coal, a lot of the corals, the coral reefs, mangroves, most of the mangroves were dead. So we raised $5 million to rehabilitate the mangroves. But you know what it brought back? The mangroves? Mangroves are the trees of the sea, right, on the edge. It brought back the Vietnamese fishing people back, to aquaculture, because mangroves are the natural aquaculture cages of Vietnamese fishing communities, not the artificial aquaculture cages we think of. So I think that mangroves and coral reefs are extremely critical. Like, I mean, I come from Queensland, Australia. That's where I live. I mean, we have the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. I mean, the discoloration of the coral reefs. For the whole world, the death of the coral reefs in Queensland is an indication of the impact of climate change. 2 degrees increase in temperature destroys coral reefs. Same in Belize. Belize has got a huge coral reef system. So they're also part of it. So while we think of trees and spirituality, let's not forget that there's an environmental context. So you so rightly pointed out mangroves and coral reefs. Thank you very much. Do you want to ask anything? Oh, well, no, there are more questions coming.
There are a few more good questions.
Yeah, what do you think the most powerful aspect of Wangari Maathai's actions? very obvious whoever asked that question. She did what she did, not because she wanted recognition. She believed in it, and the women believed in it. They planted the trees. But the fact that it was recognized, means that there's a multiplier effect. It was value. Mangiri Watai, what she did, it's been valued. And sometimes awards and prizes could be, have a class basis. They could perpetuate class reproduction. Sometimes they could also have a very good multiplier effect, like they did in the case of Mangiri Mathai. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. We're destroying our own homes. I think I can't see any other question that.
Yeah, I think people are,
comments.
I think you've done an amazing job, Amar, answering all the questions. I think people are chiming in support of what you're saying. But as we conclude, I must say, am I right to say the future is in women's hands?
It definitely is. And I tell you what, I have 3 children, 3 daughters, and I'm totally with you. The future is in women's hands.
Okay, well, thank you, Amar. I think on this note, thank you for this fascinating talk. We belong to the land, and it's so essential to educate and engage future generations. There's still so much that can be done, and today is a day, I think, of hope. What would you like to share, Amar, as we conclude today's talk?
Well, do you want me to be very honest, Sonia? I've been very honest.
I don't think you can do it any other way, Amar. So please.
When I was young, coming from a very rural, highly marginalized community in Andhra Pradesh, you see all these rich people, you see all these educated people, and you feel that, oh, they're all very cultured, sophisticated. I want to be like them. Just like people see Bollywood, Hollywood movies and want to be something that they're not. I was no different. So not being a Hindu, I tried to be more the Hindu than the Hindus initially. And then I tried to be more British than the British. And the turning point came from an Irish friend of mine from Galway. I was working on the Amaravati sculptures in the British Museum. We were having dinner and discussing, and she said to me, you're so white. I said, what do you mean? She said, you should be proud of your culture. I said, I am proud of my culture. What do you think I'm doing? But no, you're not. You're aspiring to be something different. You're trying to be more British than the British. You're trying to be more white than the white. That was the turning point. So we need honest friends to tell us when we're destroying trees, when we're destroying the environment. We need honest people, to tell us. And that was a turning point for me. And I learned from so many people, and so many people in my life, most of them women. And I would like to mention 2 women from India that most Indians would know about. One is Professor Romila Thapar from Jawaharlal Nehru University. She was my mentor, my supervisor, my research supervisor. The other one who passed away recently, Dr. Kapila Vatsyayan, Kapilaji as we call. And she's the one who established Indira Gandhi National Center for the Arts, all the Ministry of Culture, worked with Nehru, Indira Gandhi, amazing woman, brilliant scholar, brilliant dancer, So it's these 2 women, plus my own mother and grandmother. It's because of them I am who I am. And by the way, one last thing I want to share.
Please.
I think my strength comes from my grandmother. You know why, Sonia?
Tell me.
I have an uncle who is younger than me, a few days younger than me. And my grandmother had plenty of milk. So I was breastfed by my grandmother. That's where my strength comes from. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amar. Thank you for supporting Green Sakthi. Thank you for being an advocate for trees. Thank you for this beautiful talk. And thank you to all the women that nurture and take care of our planet. And let's hope that regardless of gender, we understand the necessity and the urgency to take care of our home. Thank you so much.
Thank you for hosting.
Thank you so
Sonia.
much,
Much
Amar.
appreciated.
All the best to everyone. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.